Your man out of Japan, Jay Contra here, and someone in the comments asked so interesting a question that I wanted to devote a whole video to it. And that question was, after this public health crisis goes away, or at least becomes much more managed than it is now, will we see Japanese game prices increase? And there's really a lot of factors that we need to keep in mind when we actually try to answer that question. The first is, how do video games actually get taken out of Japan? Or how do people collect Japanese video games? And it's actually much more complicated than I think people give it credit for, because so much, and even I've thought this at certain times, and I think it is a key factor, is just the number of tourists that have been going to Japan has, I think since 2012, when I first went to Japan, it's gone up, I think, like 400%, like literally. It's very nearly 4 times the amount of tourists are going to Japan than have gone before. And that was coinciding almost exactly with the new interest in retro game collecting back in the early 2010s. And so that is just one way of explaining why Japanese game prices have increased the way they have, is because you have this sharply risen demand from people in person going to Japan. They go to Akihabara, they see the game consoles, the Japanese versions of the game consoles that they had when they were a kid, and they buy them either as a souvenir or because they have a very deep interest in collecting those games. But I don't think that reason alone is why games have become so expensive over the last 8 years, and why they might go up when people can actually go back to Japan. Because something that we also need to keep in mind, and I think the sort of the half of the reason why they might go up a little bit, is that since, I want to say it was April or May, I can't remember the exact date, but the Japanese government actually stopped all foreigners, all people who do not hold Japanese citizenship, are essentially barred from going into Japan. And this is actually something that really gets to me as a former foreign resident of Japan, was that even if you have a work visa, or in certain cases even permanent residents, aren't being allowed back into the country. So if you had to leave Japan for some reason, we're not talking about tourists here, we're talking about people who actually have lives in Japan. If they had left Japan for whatever reason, a family emergency or whatever, they would not be allowed back in Japan. So that's a topic for a whole separate video, but that is just how essentially sealed off Japan has become, particularly in terms of the tourists who are bringing that demand with them. Going along with that is, I think, something that maybe doesn't get talked about a lot, but it's something I've seen, and I don't know the numbers on this, so I'm just kind of like throwing this out there as a theory about why Japanese prices in Japan are so cheap. And maybe even before getting into that, here's my second tangent, which is that game prices in Japan are actually at the cheapest I had seen in a very long time. I had seen some rare games that I had wanted. The two that really stuck out to me were Castlevania Aria of Sorrow for the Game Boy Advance. That was normally a $200 game. I saw that at that price very frequently in the before times, as I'll call them. And I saw it wasn't in great shape at Trader, but it was in a decent enough shape to that I kind of wish I had bought it. It was at about $120. So obviously from $200 to $120. Now the very good condition copies were at $200. And then another game that I saw, coincidentally also a Castlevania game, was Vampire Killer, Castlevania Bloodlines for the Mega Drive. That can go from anywhere to $600 to $700 in Japan in decent shape. And I saw a copy at Friends for, I want to say, less than $400. Now, that is would have been out of my price range anyways, but it was very shocking to see a $600 game go for $400. And I think the reason why I was able to find copies so cheaply was because normally those copies would have been sucked up by the tourists who were visiting Japan and don't really care that much about condition, because your average Japanese collector often has a much higher standard of condition compared to the foreigner who is coming in and sees an okay copy of Castlevania, doesn't mind that the box is beat up a little bit. They probably just want to play the game or maybe even put it on a shelf. That's maybe a different conversation. But nevertheless, I think the tourists not being there is one reason. And then to go to my original tangent, coming back to that, not leaving that loose thread hanging, was that something that doesn't often get talked about when we talk about what's affecting the price of games is what I've seen on the internet. I have two examples that I can think of very directly. One is people who go to Japan specifically to hunt for video games to then take abroad and then sell. I remember seeing on Reddit, back when I used to go on Reddit, on a lot of the threads that were posted in the game collecting subreddits were people who went to Japan and they ended up, it wasn't just for their own personal collection, but also to sell, was they would go to hard offs or they would go to, similar used game shops in Japan, and they would just suck up like loose game cubes, cartridges, all these different kinds of games. And then they would load them, into their bags, take them back to America, and then pop them on eBay. I also know a case of, I believe he's a Japanese guy who moved from Japan to, I think, like Colorado or something. I think he operates like a used video game shop somewhere in the United States. And what he would do was he would go back to Japan, and he would then somehow, I don't know exactly how, but he would source like tons of consoles and games and like fill up a shipping container and then ship those from Japan to the US and then sell those in his store in a physical location. I don't know if he had any web presence. So it is that, but multiply that by however many people were doing it. That's the thing, is that I don't know the numbers on this, but I think that's a significant factor where you had not only the tourists who were taking up the supply of video games in Japan, but also these entrepreneurs who are taking these games from Japan and taking them out. Something else in that similar vein, and I think the bigger reason why right now we're not seeing that big of an increase, or we're not really seeing it, we're seeing a decrease in the price of games in Japan. And we'll get to the out of Japan in a moment. But in Japan, we see games being at their lowest prices in a very long time because the game shops and the eBay resellers do not really have any significant way of getting games out of Japan. So the flip side of people not coming into Japan, that was a government policy blocking people from coming into Japan because of the public health crisis. But the crisis is also affecting logistics, so much so that Japan Post, probably the biggest handler of these games being sent out of Japan, both by people living in Japan and by these shops and resellers, is that the Japan Post essentially suspended like EMS services, the very fast way of shipping things, as well as air mail out of Japan. It depended on the country. I know to America, this affected me because I was trying to ship my things back to America when I was moving. Even though it was more expensive, so I ended up not going that way anyways, but air mail had been stopped to America, I think to certain places in Europe, to a lot of different countries. So the only way of shipping things out of Japan for a while, and I think it still remains this way for a lot of countries even today, is sea mail. So, things that can take anywhere from 3 to 4 months. It is the cheapest option, by the way, but I think for regular commerce, it's probably not, or for video game commerce at least, for what we're interested in, it's probably not the most viable option. This is also affected, this affects not just people who were, say, running their own small business on eBay, but this has affected big companies like Mandarake and Surugaya. There's also some companies, there are these Japanese companies, it's like Yamatoku. There are a bunch of companies that will do the same thing that Surugaya is doing, or doing what these people who are coming into Japan are doing, and they'll take up a bunch of games listed on eBay or their own website, and then ship those out to people abroad who for one reason or another can't make it to Japan. If I remember correctly, I think the only service operating in Japan are I know Mandarake will ship things via DHL. I think the big sort of name brand logistics companies like FedEx are still operating, but essentially what has happened is it's very difficult to get games out of Japan right now. And what I've noticed is that people who can get games out of Japan have actually, I don't know the price history on this, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I was looking for some carts the other day, Super Famicom carts, and I saw a game like Super Metroid going for like $40 on eBay. And I suspect that it's not only because people are able to charge higher prices for the game itself, but I think shipping prices have also shot up astronomically. So I think if we are seeing an increase in the price of Japanese games outside of Japan right now, I'll bet you anything is shipping, because right now, really the only super expensive ways of shipping, like DHL, are going to be the only ways for these eBay resellers to get their games out of Japan. But I looked at price charting to prep for this video, and I saw that Super Famicom games had sort of been flat for like the last 6 years, or like the average Super Famicom game had been. But in the last about year or so, or about whatever time is coincident with the current crisis, that's when we saw like about a 20% bump in the average price of a Super Famicom game. Now, I think price charting might not be super reliable in terms of its Japanese or how it tracks Japanese consoles, so I don't want to treat that number as gospel, but I definitely was somewhat shocked, at least by common games, interestingly enough. When I looked at the price of very expensive games on eBay, I didn't see that much of a difference from at least what I remember in the past, but I could also be wrong about that. I'm not going, I don't have scientific data here. I'm just telling you what I can remember. So with all of those factors in mind, I think we can then get to the heart of the question. Are we going to see the price of Japanese video games go up once Japan opens itself back up to tourists, once this crisis is behind us? And I think in the immediate term, if you are visiting Japan, yes, you are going to see a lot of games go up in price for a while, because you're going to have a lot of people finally coming back into Japan. Remember, we have no Tokyo Game Show this year, or at least no Tokyo Game Show that people can go to. There's no people coming over for the summer. It's been very difficult for people to get into Japan. They're finally going to probably also open up Japan to coincide with the Olympics next year. I would be very surprised if it really even happened a few months beforehand. It'll probably be about the same time as the Olympics happen, although who knows? We'll see what happens over the next couple months. But we're going to see a huge surge of people going back to Japan, because people will have planned their trips. They'll have all of this money saved up that they had originally planned to use in Japan or to spend on flights. They'll move that over a year, and then they'll hit Japan, and they'll finally have access to the games that they want. I think in the immediate term, yes, once Japan opens itself back up, we will see a significant blip in terms of the price increase of Japanese game prices. As to whether that trend holds, I think that will hold for the more modern stuff like GameCube and Wii, but I believe for things like the Famicom and the Super Famicom, prices go up a little bit, but then they'll go back down to where they are around now. Long term, I think once companies are able to finally have access to the regular Japanese logistics systems of getting games outside of Japan, I think commerce will go back to normal. I think games outside of Japan will level out and possibly even decrease in price as the supply becomes more and more available. The game collecting is very cyclical in terms of people's what they desire for their nostalgia. We are going into the 30th anniversary of the Super Famicom, and next year will be the 30th anniversary of the Super Nintendo. Maybe that will re-spark some interest in that console. Maybe we'll see some increase on the prices for the games there. But I can tell you that in general, I don't think we're going to see anything significant happen over the next year if you are living outside of Japan. That's just my prediction. I have no idea. I'm just making a guess here. If you think I'm wrong, if you think I'm crazy, and if you've noticed any weird trends in terms of Japanese video game pricing, please let me know in the comments. I'm always on the hunt for more information. Your man out of Japan, Jay Contra. Thanks for watching, and mahalo.